Hello, and welcome to Novelty Show, the podcast where we spill the truth about the ups and downs of writing and the ins and outs of the publishing industry. I'm Lainey.
I'm Alexa.
And I'm Kat, and this is episode 2, What is YA?
We'd like to start this episode by thanking our patrons for voting on this topic, and stay tuned to the end of the show when we'll answer our Patreon question of the week. Alright guys, I am so excited to talk about this topic because people get it wrong all the time, and I have so many feelings. Plus, I get to be the quote-unquote old person in her feelings about the history of YA. I'm not old. I'm not. But YA didn't exist when I was a teenager, and I'm excited.
Yeah, and I mean, it's evolved so much in the last 20 years. Even in the last, 3 years, it's been really evolving lately. So lots to get into here.
Yeah, and I feel like I was right in the thick of it when it started to really become a big, booming thing back in, 2007, 2006.
And I'm so jealous of that. I wonder sometimes what my life would be like if I'd grown up with these books. And we'll talk a bit about why we think so many adults are into YA, because this is a part of the conversation and the definition. It's shaping conversations in YA right now as well. But I have theories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that most people my age grew up with Harry Potter. I was 11 when the first Harry Potter book came out. So I, was right there in that creation of, YA as a separate genre, as Harry Potter sort of created it, but we'll get into all that.
Alexa has shouty thoughts about this. So let's dive into the history. And with a disclaimer, we're not going to do the history of books for children, because that is a really intense topic. We're specifically talking about the history of YA as we know it today, as a marketing category, which I'm also going to shout about, the definition of YA as a marketing category, because essentially until the early to mid 2000s, there really were just books for adults and books for children. And YA as it exists is a middle category. They're books for teens, or they're at least books about teens. We'll dive deeper into the definition. But I think it really surprises people who are younger, who have always had YA, who had Twilight and the Hunger Games growing up, to learn that someone only 10 years older than they are literally didn't have any of these books. They did not exist.
I know when I was in high school, I read mostly adult books because YA was such a new genre. Aside from Harry Potter, which was very popular, there wasn't a lot of options. So I read mostly adult in high school, and it was after high school when the Twilight boom really happened that I got back into YA.
When I was in middle school, I feel like the YA category was trying to find its footing. There were books that I read that were definitely for younger teens, but they wouldn't be considered for younger teens today.
Around what time was that, Lainey? We should probably define years as we're talking about this, because we are different ages. I am 35, so I was a young adult. I was a teen reader in the mid to late 90s.
I am 31, so I started high school in, I want to say 2001. I was a teen reader in the very early 2000s.
I'm 27. And I started high school in 2005, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I mentioned the mid-90s, so before I started high school, because when I was a tween reader, first of all, tweens didn't technically exist as a category, but essentially when I was that age, there was a young adults section in the bookstore, meaning it was the children's books section, and it had all of the books that you can imagine for young people. But those books that were targeted to me when I was 12 years old, they are what we would now consider middle grade, upper middle grade, and those are the books that I read. And when I was about 13, I jumped straight to adult because there was nothing in between.
Yeah, I had a really similar experience. When I was, before I turned 13, before I was a teenager, it was mostly Animorphs and Goosebumps
yes,
and The Babysitter's Club and those books that were almost YA because the protagonists tended to be young teenagers, but the books had a middle grade vibe and were middle grade length, and it was just different tones.
And now those books are young middle grade, and kind of the upper middle grade equivalents of the time would be Fear Street, which was the older iteration of Goosebumps, or Sweet Valley High. But those books and their tone would not fly as YA now because they read as younger.
I think I had a little bit of a different experience. So for me, I feel like 11, 12 was when I started to read young. I don't want to say it's YA because it technically I feel like wasn't, but I remember specifically like going into Walden Books when Walden Books was a thing.
Yes.
And the very...
And B. Dalton?
Yes. The very back of the store was where they had the younger adult type of books, and it was always just one shelf. And it had like the Buffy novelizations, which is what I would read, the Charmed novelizations that I would read, and the A-list. That was like my big YA type of series that I read, which was what I like to call West Coast Gossip Girl. Like those were the books that I kind of gravitated towards that were available for me when I was 12. And as I started getting older into the high school, middle school, high school, was when the YA category really started to boom. Because I was
so lucky.
Yeah, because when I was in high school, Twilight was published when I was in high school. Twilight has its faults, but I loved that book when I read it.
We stand Twilight, whether we like it or not, because Twilight is the reason YA books exist as they do today, and it's the reason we have careers, or will have careers.
Yeah, but regardless of your feelings about Twilight, it shaped the industry, and it was hugely influential across the board.
Yep.
And something I'll say, Lainey, similar to you, I don't know what the A-list is, but I can imagine. I had a series like that too. Same thing. I was 12 years old, and I think it was published by Delacorte, what is now Delacorte, so it was a division of either Penguin or Random House. It was called Love Stories, and they were basically Harlequin romance books for teens. But tweens, really. They were targeted at like 12-year-old girls. And those books were so influential for me, and I just weep for not having YA as it is now, because there was nothing that was a step beyond that. And that's what I needed, and that is what brings us to the early 2000s, mid-2000s. So Twilight was published in 2005, but also around that time is when Cassie Clare started publishing. It's when Holly Black started publishing. She started a few years before that, but...
John Green.
Libba Bray, all of these names. And it's when the publishing industry started figuring out, oh, we can make money off of this. There is a space, a hole in the market, which is how YA started developing as a marketing category. And really this kind of YA boom coincided with young millennials, so Lainey, becoming teenagers and the emergence of tween and teen culture and these groups as mass marketing demographics. This is not just when publishing realized we can sell them shit. It's when the movie industry realized. It's when the television industry realized. Or I should say, really, I think TV and movies came first. There were some, some of the most famous teen movies came out when I was a teenager in the mid to late 90s. And I feel like books were basically behind a bit.
Yeah, and this is also when the internet became a thing that most people had access to.
Yes.
Like, I didn't have my first computer until I had graduated high school. I was 19 and I bought my own computer because we didn't have one at home. And the internet changed everything. Like, it really changed how people interact with fandom.
And this does bring us to Harry Potter. We're going to talk about Harry Potter. Harry Potter is not YA. And I want to shout that really loudly without, blowing people's eardrums. Harry Potter is very firmly middle grade, but what I think is special about Harry Potter is I do think Harry Potter, in many ways, created YA. Because those readers needed somewhere to go. I just want to point that out because Harry Potter is then and always has been and still is shelved in the middle grade section of the bookstore. It is firmly for middle grade readers. Even as Harry and the characters aged, I don't consider 5, 6, or 7 of Harry Potter. Those don't read like YA books as we know them. But I think it opened up the readership and created a boom not only of young readers, but adult readers who were willing to read books about younger characters. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what really opened the door for Cassie Clare specifically, who literally wrote Harry Potter fan fiction, and for Twilight.
Harry Potter came out at the perfect time because I remember, I think I was like always around the same age as Harry when it was being published. I felt like I was kind of growing up with him. And then after I finished, I didn't read the 7th book, but I read up to the 6th book.
What?
It's a whole thing.
Lainey,
I know. I'm trying to reread
secrets
them.
Are coming out. I don't like it, but I read it.
For readers who were growing up with Harry, after it was said and done, it was like, what do I read next that's like that with kids my age?
And I think what made Twilight work in particular, why it hit the sweet spot, but I do keep bringing up Cassie Clare because I think the Mortal Instruments also played a pivotal role. I think they did different things. Twilight obviously broke out in a major way with adults, but I think the Mortal Instruments was really critical among actual teen readers. And both of them, paranormal obviously being a big thing at that time in the 2000s, but they're romances. And romance is a sweet spot in YA. I think it's a defining characteristic of YA that is worth bringing up and talking about.
Also, what's interesting about Cassie Clare's Shadowhunter series is that it has really evolved with the YA genre over the years.
One of the rare books,
that is
actually
still very popular and still very relevant because she's managed to maintain her similar storytelling techniques, but a lot of things about like tone and diversity and everything has really evolved. Yeah, dark as she's gone. Yeah, totally.
Let's talk about what to me I consider the true game changer. I mean, Twilight, I feel, opened the door in a way that we'll be forever grateful about. For me, the big game changer as an older reader being introduced to YA as a category and being pulled in, for me, it wasn't Twilight. For me, it was Uglies by Scott Westerfeld, and essentially the dystopian trend, dystopian books. Mm-hmm. I was 22, I was graduating from college, and for me, YA was like, it was a revelation. It was like coming home. I felt like they were the books that I really needed when I was younger, but felt just as relevant in my early 20s.
So like I mentioned earlier, for me, it was Twilight and Looking for Alaska, and Uglies as well for me that like really got me into it. I didn't read The Hunger Games until Catching Fire came out, and at that point the series was really starting to build momentum in the online world. You know, I heard about it through bloggers. This is when the first like YA bloggers really started to have a platform and be making an impact.
And what's funny for me is that I think of The Hunger Games as when YA started to become legitimized by mainstream media, because I found The Hunger Games through Time magazine. Wow. I met the book reviewer Lev Grossman, who of course is now an author, at a convention. And he said, there's this book that came out, you have to read it, it's amazing. And he gave it a glowing review in Time magazine. And Stephen King also gave it a glowing review in Entertainment Weekly. And I picked up that book, and it was, like, mind-blown. As good as YA is, I think The Hunger Games raised the game. For me, few people will ever touch The Hunger Games. Mm-hmm. I aspire to be that good. Yeah. And it was just the perfect combination of a high concept, really interesting characters.
And the voice.
Yes. And she is my favorite example of how to nail first-person present tense.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I strongly disliked first-person present tense, and that kept me from picking up The Hunger Games at first. But once I got into it, like, it changed everything.
Do you want to know why I didn't pick up The Hunger Games at first?
Why?
It's because when I would see it in the store, I thought it had to do with eating disorders. And I'm like, I don't want to read a book about that. So it wasn't until I signed up for a reading and writing young adult fiction class in college that it was on the reading list. And then I saw the movie that March, and I'm like, wow, this movie is like really awesome. It has nothing to do with eating disorders.
Right.
I love that you had a class in college on young adult.
It only lasted 2 semesters because the TA that taught it was the only one interested in young adult fiction. I did study at the University of Iowa, so that was the writer's workshop, which is worldly famous, and they're very pretentious when it comes to non-literary fiction. But I loved that class, and I appreciated that the TA appreciated YA.
And I'll say to that point, just circling back to Harry Potter briefly, where even though it's not YA, it's not a teen book, but you almost can't divorce YA and middle grade at that point in terms of they're symbiotic and they're kind of important to each other in similar ways. Because Harry Potter is the book in the series that legitimized children's literature as a whole, popular children's literature, I should say, as something worth giving academic weight, academic study, that there could be literary merit to these titles. And I think that also helped YA a lot.
I mean, also Harry Potter is the reason that there is a children's and YA New York Times bestseller list.
Yep.
Because all the adults got really mad that this children's book was at the top of the list for so long that they created a whole other list so that the adult list could remain pure and pristine. And like there could be a kids list for that kid book.
So all of this brings up, what is YA? The hotly debated topic. And a lot of people try to do this hot take. They make videos, they do blog posts, they do tweet threads. And for me, I always know as soon as they say Harry Potter is YA, I'm like, you're canceled. But what actually is it? How do you define YA? And by extension, what is middle grade? What is new adult? Because I feel like it's hard to talk about YA without covering those categories as well.
Yeah. And also, we're going to be talking about what YA is now as of March, April 2019.
Yes.
Because this is constantly evolving.
If we'd recorded this 3 years ago, we'd say different things.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is very frustrating, and you're allowed to be frustrated.
Yeah, so what is YA? It's always changing.
Well, or even 10 years ago, it really was supposed to be books for teens, and that's just not what it is anymore.
Right.
But a constant. Okay, a constant. The characters in the books are teenagers.
Usually.
And specifically, they are 15 to 18 years old. And even more specifically, 90% of the time, they're 16, 17, or 18.
Yes.
I think that currently the age of the protagonist is becoming less important.
Yes.
And it's more shifting to a focus of writing style and tone of the book. Because we are seeing more protagonists who are 19 and 20 and in college. And we also see stories where if the characters are all 16 years old, but if they were 20 years old instead, nothing about the story would change.
Yes, though I will say age matters less on the top end. On the bottom end, it remains kind of a no man's land to write about a 13, 14, or 15-year-old protagonist, but we are going to talk a bit about middle grade in a moment. But just kind of a note that 16 and up with 20 as the upper limit most of the time. But you're right, it's really tone and style, which makes YA a lot like porn. Which means oh yes, this is my favorite.
Let's hear this.
Yeah, how?
There was a judge who did a ruling, and it was about pornography, and he famously said, "I know it when I see it." And it's the same thing with YA. You just know it when you see it. It's the way it's written. It's themes of the story. It's the chosen focus of the story. Something that is important is YA tends to take place over a very short period of time, meaning in a single book, a character isn't going to age over a large number of years typically. It's a slice of life, a moment in a teenager's lives, at most a school year, usually. And the way that you focus the story really determines whether it's YA or adult.
And a lot of what YA does is it's coming of age, but not necessarily just that. It's a focus on firsts. It's about, first love, the first time you realize that most adults are full of bullshit. It's the first time you're making decisions purely for yourself, and you have like a lot of agency over what you are doing, and you're not necessarily being controlled by a parent, or a parent is making all your decisions for you. It's you figuring out who you are as a young adult in the world.
Yeah, it's a huge identity thing, I feel like. All teenagers try to figure out who they are, who they want to be, and that is something that is definitely explored always in YA.
A really good distinction I've heard between middle grade and YA specifically is that middle grade focuses more on finding your place in your community, especially in friendships and relationships with parents, whereas YA is about discovering who you are, your identity, your place in the world, and breaking away from those authority figures, establishing yourself as a person. And
I mean, I think that's why there is so much young adult appeal to people in their early 20s, because as a real person, being in your early 20s, you're still figuring stuff out. You know, you graduate from college, you have to get your first apartment, you have to figure out how to adult, you have to figure out how to pay your bills and just manage your own life completely on your own.
And another defining hallmark is all YA has a sense of immediacy, and so many of the high stakes are rooted in the emotions of the characters. It's big emotions, it's big feelings, it's things that would seem insignificant or little to an adult person who has greater control over kind of their emotions, that it would seem really dumb. But to a teenager, having a fight with your friend is like a big deal and the worst thing in the world. And it's kind of that...
everything is life or death.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's how it feels to be a teenager. And YA is what it feels to be a teenager. It's putting your reader back into that headspace and really exploring the feelings and perspective of teenagers.
So since YA is kind of hard to define on its own, let's talk a little bit about YA versus middle grade versus new adult, because by defining these other categories, we might be able to differentiate them a little bit better.
This is where I cackle evilly. So the most important thing I can emphasize that I think when this gets left out of the categories conversation, it's to everyone's detriment. And that is to understand that these are marketing categories and that they do evolve and change, as we mentioned. So they are primarily defined by the age of the protagonists, but also by those key story elements that we've been talking about and defining for YA. They are not defined by who the book is for, technically, with some exceptions. So meaning, as we all know, YA, if you defined it by who the book is for, what would it even be when over 50% of people who read young adult fiction are adults? Middle grade is definitely for younger readers. It is pretty defined. It's for readers who are like between 7 and 12. However, you're actually marketing primarily to their parents, to teachers and librarians. And so that's why in middle grade it definitely is, it's best to focus on the ages of the characters in the stories and then how the stories are told. But middle grade is essentially a marketing category. It's how a publisher knows, well, they're marketing to parents and teachers and librarians. And in some cases, direct to actual children, like at scholastic book fairs. But really, marketing doesn't usually reach the kids themselves.
And then, yeah, with YA, you're marketing directly to the readers of YA. Because even if you're marketing to actual teenagers who are 16 or younger, 15, 14, and they don't have their own disposable income, they're still the ones asking their parents for a specific book. They're the ones who are asking for that. And again, over 50% of YA readers are over the age of 18 and are purchasing the books for themselves with their own money.
Should we talk a little bit about new adult? I feel so many thoughts about new adult. I feel like it's the one category that everybody wants, but it never translates. If you don't know, new adult is kind of a dead category in the traditional publishing sense. It's a very...
It failed.
Yeah, but it is very present in self-publishing.
Right.
It's mostly a romance category.
It is a romance category, let's get real.
It wasn't intended to be when they tried to make it a thing, but that's how it ended up playing out.
But the thing is, any book with a character who's over the age of 18, who's going out in the world and discovering things and having adventures, that's just adult literature. I find new adult fascinating, honestly. I've always seen it as a category romance genre. To me, it feels like chick lit, but younger. And I think that's great. I don't know why there's such a push. Like, no, we want NA to be more than that. I'm like, why? It's great the way it is. It hasn't taken off in traditional publishing because they'll just publish those books as romance, and that's fine.
I do have a theory.
Yes.
I feel like in the next 10 years, NA is not really going to be a thing, but it's going to be part of YA. I think as the readers grow with YA, they don't want to leave YA, which I think we'll talk a little bit about later, especially from our perspective. It's just the YA category is going to be bigger. There's going to be a lot more 19, 20, 21-year-old protagonists in the YA category than the crossover outliers we have today.
I support your theory and have additional thoughts.
Let me hear them.
Something I think doesn't often get captured when you're talking about NA, but also about crossover YA, which is exactly what you're talking about, Lainey, is what crossover YA captures and new adult tried to capture or tried to make bigger than it is emerging adulthood, which is a real thing in sociology, and it's defined as a phase of the lifespan between adolescence and full-fledged adulthood, meaning it's different from teenagerhood, which is a phase of life. Teenagers as a thing basically were defined in the 50s. Teens didn't exist before that, theoretically. And so we're always evolving in terms of how we approach developmental psychology and kind of phases. And I actually think emerging adulthood is a symptom of millennials, of changing technology, of the economy. And I think that's where the consumer need comes from. It's a need for stories about emerging adulthood specifically. And then I think you're absolutely right. I think YA will just grow and change to encapsulate more of those stories.
I mean, which it should, in my opinion, because, I mean, if we're going to go down to definitions, young adult to me are people until they're 23, 24, in my opinion. Like, so I don't know why publishing always just has this teen cloud over the YA category. To me, should be expanded more.
Well, I think this actually kind of goes back to the history of YA. And this brings us actually to lower YA, which we need to talk about because it no longer exists. But when YA did start booming in the mid to, or, early mid 2000s, that's what YA was seen as. Think about Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, or even something like Ella Enchanted. Gossip Girl. We brought up Gossip Girl, Pretty Little Liars. I can think of a ton of these series that hit that sweet spot, but we would now define them as lower YA. And so at the time that YA was developing, everything was actually written with actual teens in mind. TM, actual teens. And the category has been shifting and changing and pushing older and older and getting darker and darker.
YA today is definitely always pushing the boundaries. I'm seeing more protagonists being 18 years old, which is like the very high end of YA according to publishers. And I really think that if publishers opened up the possibility to have people in their early 20s be included in the young adult category, that we would see more of a space for lower YA again. Because if you open it up, then all of these characters or all these age groups can be included in this larger category, which right now can't exist.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, especially when it comes to college age protagonists. Like, they have a lot more in common with teenagers than they do with adults. And like, the reason those kind of books are difficult to classify is because most readers of adult fiction don't want to read about college age young adults.
Raising my hand, I'm one of them.
Yeah, like if I were to read adult fiction, I would want to read people in their mid to late 20s. Where exactly do these college age protagonists fit in? Because there's not really like a marketing category for them. And I think that's why so many of them stick with YA books, because they resonate more with those themes, and adult readers don't want to read about kids in college.
Well, and I should say exception. I'm fine to read college set stories if they're written in the style that I enjoy, which is the YA style. And so I think that's to your point, Lainey, where I think we are going to see more expansion, especially as YA writers are the ones writing these books. I mean, we've already had one of them, Fangirl, crossover. We have Leigh Bardugo's Ninth House coming out. And it is an adult book, but it's still Leigh Bardugo, so it's going to bring in a YA readership, and it'll still feel like a Leigh Bardugo book. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. Veronica Roth has an adult book coming out, but I'll be really curious to kind of read it. I assume it's going to feel like her other books. And we're in a very interesting time because how is publishing going to market these books? Because it's basically like, hey, this will read like a YA novel, even though it's not a YA novel. So you should pick up this book because it sounds like your favorite books. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to make that work. That's where I see the evolution happening.
Yeah, I think these bigger authors like Leigh Bardugo and Veronica Roth can pioneer almost to experiment with this kind of category.
Well, it's basically bringing the immediacy of YA and that close, fast-paced reading experience to adult. And also, I think another aspect of YA that they're bringing more to adult, which is great, is complex, layered female characters driving their own stories, which is another hallmark of YA. Really, and one of the reasons it boomed, it's this category where women writers get to write female characters with agency and complexity, and they get to have full and interesting lives and experiences on the page.
And it's interesting talking about Leigh Bardugo because Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom are the books that I have in mind the strongest when I think of, like, if these 16-year-old characters were 20, 21, early 20s instead, like, nothing about the story would really change.
Yeah, I raise my eyebrow at a lot of YA, especially genre YA, because when you don't have high school, it does beg the question of, like, well, they could be older and it would be totally fine.
Right.
So I think it's in those genre spaces we are pushing the envelope. I mean, the protagonist of my next book is 19, pushing that line, pushing it up.
I mean, even Christine Riccio's book, her debut novel, the main character is 20 and studying abroad in college. And it has a very YA tone and sense of humor and pacing, but the character is discovering herself in a college situation. She's completely on her own. Her parents aren't super involved. And yeah, it's right in that crossover area that Wednesday Books is really doing a lot with.
They're great at that, yeah. Well, just something else I want to say about lower YA briefly is just to, like, let people know that currently where lower YA has gone and is sitting is we now call it upper middle grade. So meaning you can take a book that, if a book is too light to feel like it fits in YA, you just tweak the character ages, maybe remove a bit of romance, and you can make it work as an upper middle grade. A great example of an upper middle grade would be The School for Good and Evil. I would also honestly class Percy Jackson as a really solid upper middle grade because those characters do age, but the books always feel middle grade. Rick Riordan is great at that space. Yeah. And also what I consider a hallmark of upper middle grade is those books are the easiest for adults to read.
I think the key is really tone.
Tone. Absolutely.
Like, tone is absolutely what separates it. Like, that's why the Harry Potter books, even, you know, books 4, 5, 6, 7, the later ones that some people could classify as YA because the characters are teenagers and they're starting to struggle more with finding their place in the world. Yep. But the tone of the books is still middle grade.
Yeah.
It gets darker and the characters get older, but it's that middle grade tone.
Middle grade is changing as YA is changing. Middle grade can be darker. Middle grade, the characters can get older. You can have a little bit of romance in your middle grade. Not as much romance as YA. And so really, so much of the shift that we've seen in YA really is tone. Which brings us to the big debate that people are talking about a lot lately as the category stretches and grows and everyone's throwing up their hands like, what is happening? And that is, who is YA really for? Is it for teens when more than half the readership are adults? And I'd say it is the adult readership that has pushed YA tonally darker.
And also the adult readership that made YA such a lucrative market for publishers. They're the ones spending their own money to buy the books. I have done it with lots and lots of books, lots and lots of money spent on YA books.
And that's again why it is important to think about these as marketing categories. It's why I harp on it with people, partly so that they understand it's organic. Marketing is an organic beast. And that is why these categories are shifting and changing, because it is about money. Traditional publishing is always sitting down and going, all right, how do we sell books? And they noticed, oh, you know who buys books? Adults with money. And the books that are moving and selling are darker. They push the envelope more. They defied that stereotype of YA that you couldn't have serious issues in the book. They couldn't be dark. There couldn't be sex, etc. And so it's the books that push the envelope that sold the most, and it turns into a feedback cycle of we want more of those. And that is what pushed lighter, fun YA out of the market and down into middle grade. And there still actually is a no man's land of types of books like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants that wouldn't sell today. And I am sad about that. And I do want something to emerge to fill that place, because I think we're really missing out by not publishing any of those stories.
Yeah. And the thing is that the people who are missing out the most is the actual teenage readers who need those books and who those books would really mean a lot to them. That's absolutely agree with you. Why YA started skewing darker and older is because the 20-something adults who read YA don't want to read about the 14-year-old in high school. They want to read about the 17-year-old not in high school, in the Hunger Games, killing people. But the thing is, what they want is a category that doesn't really exist, and that's why books are being pushed more in that direction. They want what new adult could have been.
Well, and really isn't that what it is? YA has simply evolved to become that, which I think is interesting.
I feel like it's really grown with the people that shaped it.
Yes.
So the people that are our age, or maybe I guess my age, that were there when it was first beginning and grew with it and don't want to leave it.
Well, and also people my age, older millennials and some younger Gen Xers who got it when they were older and similarly don't want to let go because it's gosh, they wish they'd had these books all along. That's certainly how I feel. I feel YA has such potential beyond just being by teens for teens. It's such it really is a universal category in my opinion, and I would actually love to talk a bit more about what we love about YA, because I think it's about kind of getting to the bottom of what YA really is in its soul and why we love it, why we love it as readers, but also as writers. Why are we writing YA?
I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons. For me personally, a huge part of it is growing up with it as a young adult in my late teens and early 20s. It was the genre, the category that I loved and that really resonated with me. And I do still enjoy the stories.
For me, as I mentioned, a huge part of it is that it's primarily books by women, about women, about girls, and it's for women because the majority of YA readership is female. There are, of course, exceptions. I'm not, this isn't an anti-male thing. There are obviously some very famous, beloved male YA writers who we've mentioned on this podcast who have really shaped us. But even then, most of them are writing about female characters in many cases. So the protagonist of Uglies was a girl. For me, when I discovered it at the age that I discovered it, part of what was mind-blowing about it was for the first time I was reading books that really centered lots of different kinds of women. I could finally read about people like me, even if they weren't exactly like me, and it was specifically female characters driving their own stories. That was honestly the biggest part of it for me.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I love to write YA is because for me, when growing up, that was my escape. I loved falling into that story. I loved really wanting to be that character, even if I was nothing like them in real life. And it really shaped who I was growing up. And I really want to be that kind of writer for someone else, for that teenage girl who's just wanting to escape.
Yeah.
Same.
I also love the heightened emotions of it. Yes. Everything is so important and life or death. First love is the only love. It's the strongest love you've ever had. And there is also a degree of, they tend to be more optimistic because, they are about young people who have so much potential and so much room to do anything, to be anything. And I love exploring that and like being back in that mind state where, I could choose a different path. I love the exploration of, seeing the world for the first time and, learning that the world is bigger than you thought it was. It's bigger than your smaller community. Like we talked about the difference between middle grade and adult. Like you're not just contained to this one side of the world, this one little area. Like there's the whole world. There's so much potential, so much possibility. Mm-hmm. Everything feels so important. And I love that.
Yeah, and really discovering like who you are, who you want to be.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm still trying to figure that out.
It doesn't stop.
Yeah.
Well, and generally another reason, I mentioned earlier the millennial generation and the economy, and I think that does lead to kind of, in many ways, this generation, it's funny, we're all part of it, but we're at different points on it. And Gen Z is going to have an even harder time. In many ways, we're an arrested development generation.
Right.
Meaning everything is taking longer and is slower to start, and we have less money, and there's more crap going on, and what it means to be an adult, the definition has had to change with our generation.
We are no longer getting married super early, buying houses super early.
We can't afford houses.
Yeah. Having kids super early. We can't afford any of that.
So I think that YA really speaks to that, and also I adore character-driven stories, period.
Right.
And YA is a category that supports that. It's all about character, really, or at least I think the best YA stories are. You still need a plot. You still need a high concept something, but think about all of the memorable characters in YA. And as you said, Lainey, it's putting yourself in that character's shoes and experiencing the story with them. I adore that about YA, and that is part of the YA style that we've been talking about, that I think many authors are taking beyond YA, strictly YA, like Leigh Bardugo writing Ninth House or Veronica Roth writing her adult book. Another really good example that came out last year was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because YA is predominantly female-driven. It's books about women written by women. Sometimes the other edge of that double-edged sword is that some adult authors who are writing adult books those books are being lumped in with YA simply because the author is a young woman. And even though this young woman is writing adult books that in tone, in style, in content are very adult, many people will still kind of just say like, oh, it's you're writing YA because you are a young woman.
Yeah, that's definitely a double-edged sword. And that's another reason the industry really has to evolve. Meaning, because at the same time, some of those very same books still were marketed to young adult readers, and it's hard to have it both ways.
Right.
And so meaning we have to evolve. We and the publishing industry have to evolve in our definitions. Because it's not fair to an author who has very firmly written an adult book, but in a YA style. Well, but also, actually, let me stop myself mid-thought, because then that brings up so many questions for me of, like, why is it an insult to be called a YA author? I think there are two sides to it.
I don't think it is an insult at all. I think it's just
but
about,
it can be. Some people do use it to put down those writers.
That's absolutely true.
And that's a problem.
Well, I just think everybody loves to shit on young teenage girls and
yeah, I mean that's why they do it to fandom too.
I mean it's just women in general.
People don't like things that young girls like, so
an adult fantasy, it tends to be mostly dominated by male authors and about male characters. So a woman writing in that territory, in that category, tends to be belittled for really no reason except for her gender.
Which actually brings us to misconceptions about YA, which I think are worth discussing, especially if we have any listeners coming in here who are less familiar with YA, who maybe have some of these preconceived notions that we would love to dispel for you. And the first one is that YA is dumbed down, that it's more simple, than adult literature.
I think simple is a very loaded word in this sense because they tend to be more simple in the way that they have limited points of view and they are more narrowly focused on like one character or two characters, like a few characters, whereas adult can get like very epic and sprawling. But I think people do take it as simple to mean dumbed down, and that it can't be as complex. It can't be smart.
Absolutely. And part of that is in the stigma against things for teenage girls and things for teenagers. The idea that if you're writing for children, you have to dumb down your work. And so this stigma actually applies to middle grade as well. But in my view, good children's literature is often smarter in a lot of ways than good adult literature.
And with YA, the readers tend to be a little less forgiving in regards to slow pacing. Like, you need to get right to the story, you need to keep their attention all the way through. Readers of like adult fantasy tend to be more patient and, you know, enjoy that sort of slow build-up. But in YA, it's a really different tone. And it's not saying that one is better than the other. It's just know your market, know what you're writing.
And the other misconception that we kind of spoke about was no adult content, that YA is also less complex because, well, there's no sex or drugs or drinking or swearing, and that is not true and is a huge part of this expansion of YA that we're talking about. There's more and more of that as these books depict more about the real lived experience of many teens, and they don't lead clean lives.
I also do believe, though, that publishing likes to protect young adults in this area.
Yes.
Like, a lot, because I often think of this when I'm writing, because one of the books I'm writing right now is very romance heavy for teens, I guess. I think, like, would I see this in Gossip Girl, like the TV show, or any other teen show? And I'm like, yes, I would see that, but I don't know how much you see of that in books. So it's like there's this weird thing between visual media and books that doesn't always have a translate with some of that more mature content.
I would agree with that, but it isn't absent. I think that the misconception comes from people thinking that all YA literature is Pollyanna bullshit, and it's not. I think you are right that the approach is different, especially when it comes to sex.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the misconception also comes from people who aren't familiar with the current YA category.
Yes.
Because, 5 years ago, it was a lot newer to have like sex, drugs, drinking, swearing in books. Like it was less common. But these days, like, there's a wide variety of, very clean books in regards to like drinking and swearing and everything, and books that do have that.
Another misconception I've seen, and it kind of dovetails into the, YA is dumbed down, YA is more simple. I've also heard that YA is one thing. The misconception that it is just Twilight or just the Hunger Games, and that it's very formulaic. And really one of my favorite things about YA as well as a writer is YA, because it is a category, not a genre, encompasses so many different kinds of books. And I actually think we've seen some very innovative storytelling and experimentation in YA.
Right.
Books that would never have been published outside of YA. And I mean, even just the Hunger Games, I think really like did something special that I'm not sure would have happened outside of YA, because it is a readership that is willing to take chances on weird books, is I guess the way I want to say it. Or even a book like Fangirl. Right. I think YA was the perfect space for a book like that.
Yeah, that's why whenever I read a hot take article about the YA category that mentions like the Hunger Games and Divergent as their examples, I know immediately that person is not actually familiar with the YA market today.
I think ultimately the important thing to remember when you're asking what is YA is that it is constantly evolving. The core of it, of course, is these books are definitely about teen characters, young characters. It's always coming of age, but it's got these other kind of sweet sauce aspects that we've talked about with immediacy and pacing and the focus and the writing style. YA has changed so much since it first emerged and boomed as a marketing category, and it's going to change again. And when you're asking what is YA, is my novel YA, the key thing is to make sure that you're reading YA, current and recently published YA, because it's always changing, and you can't depend on a book you read 5 years ago to tell you what YA is.
It changes every few years. Like, it's an entirely different landscape.
But even as it changes, I do think the soul of the books does stay consistent. But trends in theme and tropes and execution, that is what has been changing and evolving. And it could be just a matter of going, this is a novel for young people, but is it upper middle grade instead of YA?
Right.
Or maybe publishing will listen to us and bring back that lower YA sweet spot. Just call it teen. I don't know.
They just need to expand it. Cowards.
Yeah. The problem with the market is that we can't control it. Like, the market is kind of evolves on its own. Like, I would love to have a teen category and a young adult category to kind of differentiate these stories with like slightly different tone or content or characters or the stories. Just saying that I want a teen category and a young adult category doesn't mean it's going to happen, because it's marketing categories. It's based on what sells. It's based on factors out of any individual's control.
I don't know. I really think we're going to be seeing a bigger change in 10 years. Like, it's...
Oh, yeah.
I think so,
yeah,
too.
I really think it will expand and all those spaces will come back, basically.
Yeah, I think YA is heading toward a split, like the same way children's books got split into like children's and teens, like middle grade and YA. I think we're heading toward another split.
I would agree.
I hope we're heading toward another split.
Same. I really do want more books that are essentially adult books that read like YA.
Yeah, that's what that's all I want. That's why I read YA still.
Just character-driven, immediate stories with great hooks written by great writers.
I think we already see that, but they're just being disguised as YA books because that's all that they can be right now. Like, I mean, I read primarily YA fantasy. So I'm thinking of, like, obviously Sister Crows, what we just talked about. That is definitely a crossover book hiding in disguise.
All of Sarah J. Maas's books.
Yeah, and even Saba Tahir.
Yes. Susan Dennard is another really good example. The entire Truth Witch series is a crossover book series.
And, you know, a lot of indie published and self-published authors are thriving in this, like, in-between, not quite YA, not quite adult category.
Absolutely. Especially in the genres that have fallen out of favor.
Right.
In traditional publishing, like paranormal and urban fantasy.
Yep.
I guess what's really just important to me, whether it's traditional publishing or otherwise, is that these books continue to exist, that people continue to write them and find the right publishing avenue for them.
Now it is time for our Patreon question of the week, and this one is from Mackenzie, and they would like to know, how can you tell if the tone of your story is not working and needs a shift, and how could you lighten the tone if you need to?
Oh gosh, it's like porn again.
You know it if you see it.
This is so subjective. It's tough. Well, I guess first, you can tell if the tone in your story isn't working if you're feeling something in your gut. The fact that Mackenzie is asking this question perhaps means that Mackenzie is feeling this about a story that they have. And also reader feedback. You can directly ask them. I'll tell you, I had my editor tell me, and I knew it in my gut though, that something that I had done in an edit had shifted the tone, specifically in my first act, so that it was basically really dark and morbid, and didn't then match the tone of the rest, which was a lot lighter and soapy. So sometimes it's directly asking someone you trust, what tone are you getting? And if they give you the wrong answer, you go, oh shoot. Houston, we have a problem.
For me, it really comes down to voice and humor. Those are the two aspects that I feel control the tone of the story the most. Because you can get very dark and into very like morbid territory, but if you lighten it up by having, you know, the character's voice is not taking things too seriously, or they are cracking jokes throughout it and adding their own humor to it, that can lighten the tone. But I know that some of my favorite stories are stories that like really nicely balance that darkness with the humor. Joss Whedon, Buffy, has a great balance of like horror and darkness, but also lightness and humor. So yeah, I think it's just about studying voice and humor and analyzing it in your own work. And like Alexa said, getting feedback.
Yeah, I was going to say definitely lean on the people that you trust to help you figure out what you're trying to say. When I sit down and think about the tone of the story, it's like a feeling. So I'm always trying to achieve that feeling whenever I'm writing it.
And I will say, in terms of the second part of the question, how to change your tone and make it lighter if you need to, I found that I had to, in the case of my book where I basically messed it up, I had to change the thing that had catapulted the first act into a darker territory, because often tone, it comes from your characters, your main characters, and how they need to react to something. And I'll say, in my case, it is definitely possible to write something so dark that there's no way to write it lightly and irreverently without writing a very tonally specific, humorous book. And maybe that's not what you want to do. I had to pull back on the dark thing that I did so that my characters didn't have to get as morbid about it. I basically unkilled a child. I'll just put it that way. Oh, yeah. See, exactly. It's why did I do that? But so sometimes it is actually a plot problem.
Right. And I think sometimes just rewriting almost from scratch is like what you have to do. Sometimes it's not as easy as like, you know, doing a pass-through edit and like changing some sentences. Sometimes you really need to figure out like what the scene is trying to accomplish, like character, setting, location, and just come up with a different situation that accomplishes what you need to accomplish in that scene, and just write a different version of it.
All right, that is our episode. Again, thank you to all our patrons for your support. You can check out our page at patreon.com/noveltyshow, where our patrons can suggest topics, ask questions, and vote in polls.
We also broadcast live shows on YouTube on our channel Novelty Show. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Novelty Show and tweet us questions using #NoveltyShow.
If you like us, please subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice, and we'd really appreciate if you can rate and review us on iTunes and Google Play. Doing so helps bump us up in the ratings and helps other listeners find us.